With political analyst Khaya Sithole. Khaya, good to have you. Thanks so much for chatting to us this morning.
Thank you and good morning to the viewers.
All right, so we were all waiting yesterday. We saw many meetings that were taking place at the union buildings. To a certain extent, I wasn't too surprised that the president didn't address the nation last night because I'm sure major decisions are being taken there. What was your response? Were you surprised or not?
Look, I think I'm probably one of those people who didn't even bother to find the TV next to me yesterday because I just didn't think that there was going to be sufficient time for him to address the nation, unlike last week where the sense of anticipation had been created and we all stayed up until he eventually addressed us. I think the type of decisions that need to be taken now are so fundamental and pervasive in nature. It's definitely going to take a lot of consultation and a lot of scenario planning. And I think obviously the big question here is, do they have a series of scenarios on the table that are now saying this is where we think we're headed and therefore this is how we're going to react to it? Or are they still trying to work out what really the nature of the crisis is? And I suspect yesterday was probably not the type of day where they could have really said this is what we think is going on and this is where we're headed. So it wasn't surprising at all that they're not in a position to finish their consultations by last evening.
Yeah. Let's talk to some of the calls that are being made. And I mean, it seems to be a growing call from everybody, not everybody, let's just say quite a large portion of the nation to say, let us lock down, let us shut down. What do you think of this call?
Look, the difficulty here is that if society is going to come out and say we need to lock down, the question is why do they need a directive from the state to tell them to do so? And I think the issue here is that we have to acknowledge that we all are equally responsible for taking care of ourselves and for ensuring that should we be infected in one way or another, we don't pass on the transmission to the next person. So this is one of those instances where you would think that everybody would have the presence of mind to say, never mind what the president has said, never mind what the government has said. I personally think that my chances of not contracting the virus are much better if I can either reduce my interactions with other people or if I can self-isolate. So for me, the question of why we're demanding that the president be the one that issues the instruction is a bit lost, because you would think that having seen the data coming out from other countries, having seen the statistics and the visuals, we should all understand that should something go wrong, it literally escalates at the type of rate that we cannot control. So I don't understand why we would wait for a directive to come when we can all see, when we can all read what happens when we don't actually take the initiative ourselves to say, I'm staying away from church for a couple of weeks, I'm staying away from restaurant for a couple of weeks in order just to ensure that I do not run at the risk of being infected.
Yeah, this is up to people, and they need to make these calls on their own lives. I mean, for goodness sakes, we don't actually need people to tell us to stay away from bars and restaurants and major shopping malls. But let's talk the economics behind all of this now. So South Africans are staying away to a certain extent, but you still get large quarters that are not staying away and they're still going out, they're still shopping, they're still doing what they have to do. The reality is, what would this do to our economy if there is an order to shut down, i.e. shopping centres close, businesses close, everything happens? We haven't heard of stimulus packages coming through at all. So before we talk stimulus package, let's talk to the repercussions of a shutdown on the economy.
Obviously, the economy itself would not be immune from the direct repercussions of a shutdown. And the reality here is that a lot of businesses in the country depend on what we call foot traffic. So whether it's a restaurant or whether it's a taxi business, they depend on people leaving their homes and then deciding that actually today I need to be able to acquire the service from you. So here I am to either collect the service or to buy something. So when you then enter into a shutdown mode, it means that the foot traffic itself dries up. Now, when the foot traffic does dry up, then there's the secondary question of, are you as a business still in a position to get those goods and services to your consumers and to the end user using alternative means? Now, obviously, if you're running an IT business, the answer is different. If you're running a restaurant, the answer is different. And if you're running a taxi business, the answer is fundamentally different. So there is really going to be a lot of repercussions across the ecosystem, across various economic sectors. Some might be able to then minimize the impact by being able to do something in the alternative to ensure that they can at least get some cash flow going, but those cash flows are unlikely to be at the same level as they were in the absence of a shutdown. So I think the problem is that a lot of businesses are unfortunately going to feel the impact of this and are going to feel the pinch of this. And then the secondary question becomes, how long are we in a form of a shutdown or in a form of a slowdown? Because unfortunately, just because people didn't come and buy from you today doesn't mean that your electricity bills or even your utilities and your rent doesn't become due. Those types of costs are going to be due every single month, and until you are able to then say, look, I can actually raise money from alternative sources in order for me to cover those costs, it really escalates the possibility of businesses shutting down.
Yeah, we've seen some incredible moves from different countries around the world as to stimulus packages that have been put in place, different decisions from both governments and business sectors saying, there'll be freeze on mortgage rates, there'll be tax relief where they can, you'll see help. I mean, I think there was something like a $3 trillion package coming from the US. However, we're in a very, very different situation here in South Africa where the economy is already struggling. What can the government do? We haven't heard from business, and that's why these meetings that are being held over the weekend are so, so important. We need to hear what has come out of them. But what, in your opinion, can be done? How do we assist businesses and the people of South Africa at this time?
No, it's not an easy one, particularly because we already had a struggling economy to begin with. So what you've seen in other countries is that the governments have then said, look, we need to intervene, we need to ensure that the economy doesn't come to a standstill. So therefore, what they've done is that they've then made it possible for them to extend some form of financial assistance to various businesses that are under distress. That's one way to do it. The alternative here is to then say, in the South African context, we probably don't have enough cash resources or the cash reserves to do the type of interventions that these other countries have done. But remember, there's always a possibility of borrowing. And I think in the South African problem, if we do borrow, it then brings us back to the question of we already feel that we're over-indebted. Now, when people say that we're over-indebted, it simply means that on an annual basis, the amount of money that we raise through taxes, far too much of it is spent on paying debt costs in relating to past borrowings that you've made. So in a case like this, the question would then be, if you do want to go and borrow, what will be the quality of that spending? Do you borrow money in order to ensure that the economy itself keeps moving and thereby in the long run translates into greater tax revenues? Or if you borrow and you spend it on the type of activities that do not on their own generate sufficient future tax revenues, then it's actually a very, very bad way of borrowing. So the problem, we don't have enough money, but we do need to do something. Should we go on borrow in order to get us to do them? That's a possibility. That remains on the table. A lot of people keep saying that the Reserve Bank is probably the one institution that should do something differently. The problem with the Reserve Bank is that its instruments of intervention, particularly the interest rates, have a very, very slow effect, if you want to call it that, of translating into real economic activity. So, for example, last week they said that decreasing interest rates by 1%. Now, when that decrease of interest rates happens by 1%, it then has to go through the financial system, and the financial system would simply say, well, are you already exposed to us or not? So if you're already exposed to us, if you already have a bond or a car loan, then of course you can see the direct impact of this interest rate reduction on your monthly cash flows. But if you're not part of that system altogether, it becomes difficult for you to see exactly what that 1% translates to in terms of your own personal cash flow profile. So it's an indirect intervention that the Reserve Bank can do, while the state, on the other hand, has got much more direct instruments of intervention, which is what you've seen in other countries where the governments have simply said, here's $1 billion here, here's $10 billion here, we're going to earmark it for this industry that clearly needs assistance. Now, that form of direct assistance means that you get the outcomes at a much faster pace than you would when you simply intervene with interest rates like we've done.
Yeah. I mean, many saying that, just dropping the interest rates is surely not enough, but it is, it's a step in the right direction, but we need to hear more, and hopefully that's what we'll get today. Yesterday, we get an email, or Standard Bank do something. They sort of come out and they say, Standard Bank has announced interim debt repayment measures to help segments of its customer base to navigate their financial commitments to increase across the country. And it's a whole payment relief for the bank's small enterprise customers with a turnover of less than 20 million rand, commencing on the 1st of April. So they came out on their own issued a statement and are saying, what they're going to do to help customers. The nitty-gritty of that, we won't get into too much, but they came out and did something. And is this the way to go? Shouldn't there be, after the meeting that we are having or had yesterday, or maybe even still going on right now with business and banks and everybody else involved, that there is a blanket decision? And that not just one will come out with an announcement, then a little bit later another one. Shouldn't this be the way that we go? There's a blanket decision that is taken for every bank, for every entity that is working out there in South Africa.
Yeah, if we were in a dictatorship, it would be much easier to achieve that. But yes, you would think that the banks in particular, because they are able to operate in unison under the umbrella of BASA, which is the Banking Association of South Africa, they're in a position to actually issue a uniform statement to say these are the relief measures that we're putting on the table, and they're going to roll out across the different banks. Now, the reason Standard Bank acted unilaterally is because the directors of Standard Bank have a duty to Standard Bank itself. So, of course, for them, if they were far more proactive in assessing what the impact would be and then determining that they can actually stomach this 3-month payment holiday, then of course this is a good thing for Standard Bank to have taken the proactive stance. What it does is that it puts pressure on the other banks to say, what are you doing? Now remember also there is that alternative theory that says, well, if the banks do not provide this form of interim relief, it simply accelerates the demise of the businesses that they funded. And once those businesses are actually, going underwater, it would mean that Standard Bank in itself will probably not recover all the loans that are due to it anyway. So it's not a purely benevolent tactic. It's something that's based on the understanding that if you do not assist a business of this nature and they go under, you might end up losing more than what you're sacrificing over the next 3 months. Mm-hmm. And remember, the sacrifice over the next 3 months doesn't mean that the debt is not due. It simply means that they've deferred the repayment to a point in time where they feel that perhaps the foot traffic will recover for that restaurant so that it can generate cash flow. The foot traffic will recover for that mall so that the landlords can afford the rentals. So it's really something that's a trade-off between saying, do we squeeze them now knowing that they don't have the cash flow? And if we do squeeze them now and then it turns out 3 months later they no longer exist, how much will we have lost out? Or can we stomach this gap of 3 months? And remember, it's to a limited audience anyway, particular businesses with a specific turnover. So it's not a universal freezing of debt repayments by Standard Bank, and it will not be by any of the banks anyway.
Yeah, and I mean, you've got to look at obviously the normal person out there. You're paying bonds, you're paying so much. You've still got your taxes that you've got to worry about, and also, I mean, let's look at small businesses as well. I mean, when I'm talking about your corner hair salon, your retail that are now, I mean, shopping centres are quiet right now, and yet you still haven't gotten word from the guys that are owning these massive shopping centres as to whether or not they're going to offer any relief. Obviously, there's the talk of, we're seeing unbelievable figures when it comes to grocery stores because people are going out there and emergency buying all of these things. And of course, medical companies, whether we're talking about pharmacies or those kind of stores, they are making money that they haven't seen because it's people are out there buying. But the rest of the industry, what happens there? I've been reading a lot of these leasing agents coming out and saying, sorry, but you still got to pay.
Look, again, the leasing companies should also take the view that the banks have taken, which is to ask themselves the question that if you keep on squeezing these particular tenants, knowing very well that something that is completely beyond their circumstances affected the primary driver of their income and the primary driver of their turnover, what exactly are the consequences of you insisting on collecting repayments now? Now, of course, legally, you are well within your rights to do so. It has absolutely nothing to do with you that your particular tenant is incapable of paying in 1 month or the next. But the reality here is that it's not just going to be one tenant at the corner of the mall. It's going to be a universal issue. And if you wake up 3 months later, once perhaps the virus has subsided, only to discover that half your tenants are no longer in a position to operate, then you actually then have an additional cost burden of trying to run those particular shopping malls with high vacancy rates, and then having to source new tenants in order for them to occupy that space. And of course, that tenant that used to be a hair salon would have configured that that space differently. I want to run a different business, and then I say to you, I'll only take up that space if you change this, if you put this window there, and if you move this door there. So then there's this additional cost burden that will actually materialize for the landlords themselves if they do not step in and try to be more innovative in how they're dealing with their tenants and how they're really, restructuring the terms of the repayments. Now, of course, some people might turn around and say maybe the way we determine our rental is turnover-based, which simply means that at the end of each month, we're going to look at your books and then we're going to discover that you sold so many units, and then you say the rent is going to be calculated in reference to the number of people that showed up. Now, for businesses that do have that particular arrangement, the next couple of months are obviously going to be quite different in the sense that your rent is going to be lower on the basis that you quite simply don't have the same foot traffic that you've seen before. Yeah. Is it an ideal situation? Well, of course it isn't, because nobody goes into the business just to be able to cover their rent. They go into the business in order to be able to generate sufficient profits for them to cover the rent and also be able to be sustainable as a business. So just because the rent might be lower, because you've got a different formula, doesn't mean that that's the ideal situation. So I do think that this requires innovation across the board, and landlords, particularly the ones that own the big shopping centers, are not in a position to simply insist on the letter of the law. They need to be able to look at the long-term impact on how they're engaging with their tenants right now, because in the alternative, there'll be no tenants to engage with in the long run.
Yeah, Khaya, one only hopes that today, when we get this announcement finally from the President after meeting all of the different role players, that we'll see a uniform effort that is put together from every sector to try and help many people that right now, we keep talking about the death toll and infection rate on individuals, but a lot of other people are looking at the death toll of businesses and the infection rate of companies and how badly this is going to affect them. So we'll wait and see on that. I just want to quickly squeeze in SAA into this conversation, Khaya. We're moving into news, so I just want to get your opinion here. I mean, we've seen SAA has implemented drastic measures, including suspending international services. I mean, basically, they're flying one route, if I'm not mistaken, up and down Joburg and Cape Town. I mean, can this airline survive? I mean, can we not use that bailout money almost to try and assist everybody right now? Because SAA, is there any way they're going to get through this?
Look, I think SAA has literally flown into the perfect storm, and the fact here is that it was already under business rescue proceedings long before the virus became an international crisis. And I think even if the virus wasn't an issue, there are still a lot of questions that would have been asked about the viability of SAA. And remember, the original business rescue plan that was drafted in January, long before the crisis became an international issue, had already indicated that SAA will be better off cutting a lot of the unprofitable routes that it was engaging in. We saw that it even cut routes to Durban and all to the other local destinations, with the exception of the Joburg to Cape Town routes. What they had maintained at that stage is that the international routes, at least some of them, and some of the regional routes could still be kept alive. Now, of course, we now have this international shutdown of airspaces, which means that the regional routes that SAA used to specialize in are no longer really going to be a money spinner, because in the regional routes, the idea is that SAA collects somebody from Lilongwe, collects somebody from Harare, brings them to Johannesburg so that they can then connect onto an international flight. Now, if the international flights themselves are not flying, then there's no basis for the regional customers to be coming to South Africa to connect. So that being the perfect storm simply means that it's now quite simply impossible to imagine how SAA can survive in its current form. Now, it is running the Cape Town to Johannesburg route, but you cannot keep an entire business running on the basis of one route, particularly when you've got a subsidiary called Mango, which is also available on that route to service it. So if you believe that Mango needs a wider fleet in order to be able to service this route, well, all you have to do is pass on the planes that you have onto Mango and to say, carry on with this business. But there's no way you can even pretend that you can run an airline that runs exactly one route. It simply makes no economic sense whatsoever.
Khaya Sithole, thanks so much for talking to us. I know that we hopefully will be able to speak to you again once this announcement has been made and we can analyse some of these decisions. I mean, you look at what's happened with Emirates as well. Emirates saying that they've basically suspended all flight right now, except for cargo. They're still going to continue with cargo, as with most of other airlines, still doing the cargo route, but the passenger route, no longer.